"Pick anything you want," he said. And so it was. Until his daughter, without hesitation, replied, "We want that Apache woman to be our mom." Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind rolled down hard from the plains north of Fort Bridger, bringing with it the late-season chill that crept through clothes and stiffened hands long before nightfall. Rook Halden drove his wagon steadily along the dusty road, his daughters beside him, bundled in thick blankets that barely kept the cold at bay. Willa Maddox, the older one, had half her face hidden beneath the fabric, while Tiva Halden watched the lights of the merchant convoy up ahead, like fireflies drifting in the frosty haze. Since Mara Kessler, his wife, passed during childbirth 3 winters ago, Rook's life had narrowed into a straight, silent road, shaped by routine. Up before sunrise, fix the fences, feed the animals, cook what he could, and most of all, care for his girls. He'd trained himself to avoid unnecessary words, town gatherings, anything not essential to keeping the ranch upright. Long before he was a father, he'd served as a scout in the army. He left that life after disobeying an order that still clawed at his sleep, but the habits of caution never left him. That night, he reached the camp just as the traders were finishing their final deals. Lanterns swung from wagon posts, casting shaky light over piles of tools, bean sacks, folded blankets, and coiled rope. Some men shouted prices between dry laughter. Others hammered boxes shut or cinched cargo with quick knots. Farther back, horses snorted into the cold ground. Rook stepped down slowly, his back reminding him of every day's labor. He grabbed the grain sacks he planned to trade and carried them to Holt Mercer, the convoy leader, who counted fast and gave a curt nod. Then Rook moved to a row of tools laid out on canvas. He picked up a hinge, turned it with his thumb, judging if it could handle the windstorms that slammed his barn each winter. His thoughts had already returned home, splitting more firewood, patching Willa's torn coat sleeve, checking the stovepipe before the deep snow hit. He was mid-thought when he heard a faint, shallow breath behind the crates. Not loud, but tight enough to make him look up. Willa noticed too and leaned forward. Tiva, wordless, grabbed his wrist. Rook raised his gaze, scanning the source of the sound. There, at the rear edge of the convoy, stood a young Apache woman beside 2 spent horses. The rope tied to her wrist hung loose, but it was still knotted. Her dress was torn at one shoulder, layered in dust. The beads stitched into her clothing dangled crookedly. Her whole frame seemed held together by will alone. Legs planted but shaking, arms tucked close, breath shallow. She kept her eyes low, yet tracked everything around her with small, near-invisible glances. A convoy hand shoved a crate without looking. The rough motion made her flinch back fast. She didn't cry out, but her shoulders tensed the way someone does when they know a blow is coming. "She's scared," Willa whispered. Tiva said nothing. She pressed herself even closer against her father's coat. Rook studied the woman carefully. She didn't look dangerous or hostile. She looked like someone who'd come too far, someone who'd burned through the last reserves of her body. He turned his eyes back to the tools, telling himself not to get involved. What his daughters needed was stability, not a stranger pulled from a wagon line. But then Holt Mercer stepped up, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Good grain, Halden," he said matter-of-factly. "Take whatever you want in return," Rook replied, pointing towards the box of hinges and nails. "These will do." Holt gave a quick nod, ready to seal the deal, but then the soft voices of the girls interrupted the moment. Tiva, in barely more than a whisper, said, "She looks cold." Willa, a bit firmer, added, "We want her. We want that woman to be our mom." Rook felt a sharp pull in his chest. He turned first to his daughters. Both were looking at him with calm sincerity, eyes full of tenderness and quiet concern. Then he looked back at the woman. She hadn't heard them, but she was still standing there in that tense posture, body trembling, fists at her sides, her face clenched tight with the effort to stay upright. He turned to Holt again. "Why is she tied?" "We found her after a raid in the hills," Holt answered with a shrug, as if brushing aside the horror. "Camp was on fire. The others ran. She was left behind. We don't have time for problems. If you want her, take her. Saves us hauling her to the next stop." Something in Holt's cold tone unsettled Rook, the way he spoke of her like a thing, not a person. But worse was the memory that surfaced. Secca Vale. Another woman, another time. A mistake he still hadn't spoken aloud, not once. A weight heavier than guilt. He stepped slowly around the crates, careful to show his hands clearly. She didn't back away. She didn't lift her chin. She just watched him with those eyes. Tired, alert, the kind of gaze that no longer expected anything, but still checked for danger by habit. Rook pulled the small knife he always carried at his belt and said quietly, "I'm going to cut the rope. You're safe now." He pressed the blade gently to the cord and sliced it clean in one motion. The rope dropped to the dirt. She didn't rub her wrists. She just lowered her hands slowly, like someone unsure what came next. Her breathing changed, barely, but enough to notice. Not calmer, exactly, but less held in. Rook lifted his chin, gesturing to the wagon. "Come with us. No one's going to hurt you." For the first time, Asha Redmoon's eyes met his. He saw fear. Yes, but beneath it, a quiet recognition. She knew she couldn't go on alone anymore. She took one step toward the wagon, using the sideboard to steady herself. As she climbed up, Willa scooted over without hesitation. Tiva held out a blanket with both hands. Asha took it without lifting her head, wrapping herself tightly, like that fabric might be a shield. Rook climbed back to his seat, drew a slow breath, and flicked the reins gently. The horses moved forward, leaving the convoy behind. The night grew harsher. The wind stung the skin, and the only sounds were the creak of the wheels and the distant howl of a coyote. No one spoke. The only movement came from Asha, adjusting the blanket, and from the girls, who watched her with a mix of tenderness and stillness. Rook kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his mind drifted. He knew exactly what he'd just done. He didn't regret it, but he felt the weight of it. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman whose past he didn't know, a woman who had already survived more than most men ever would. His daughters had acted on instinct, unaware of the complexities now on his shoulders. But as the plains stretched out before them and the convoy lights faded behind, Rook Halden understood something far simpler than all the rest. Leaving her there was never a choice he could have lived with. They reached the ranch after darkness had swallowed every last trace of light. The silhouette of the cabin appeared first as a dark blot on the horizon, slowly taking shape as the horses drew closer to the corral. A single lantern hung from the porch, its glow flickering but steady in the still air. Rook pulled gently on the reins, bringing the animals to a stop. The girls hopped down with practiced ease, their boots making barely a sound on the dirt. Asha remained seated for a moment. She stared at the cabin with caution, like someone unsure if they had the right to cross a doorway that wasn't theirs. Rook stepped toward her. "You can come inside. It's warmer in there." His voice was calm. No rush, no demand, just truth. She nodded slightly, barely noticeable, then slowly stood, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before climbing down from the wagon. Her movements were slow, not from mistrust, but from a deep exhaustion that made even standing upright a task requiring focus. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the iron stove spread like a silent comfort. Willa Maddox lit another lantern and placed it on the table. Tiva Halden moved some folded blankets off a chair to make space. The interior was clean. 2 small beds pushed against the back wall, Rook Halden's cot near the stove, shelves lined with jars, tools neatly stacked under the window. Life here was simple, practical, built on habits that left no room for clutter. Asha Redmoon paused in the doorway. The smell of firewood and cooked beans floated through the air. A familiar scent, but one she hadn't felt safe near in weeks. Rook noticed her hesitation and stepped aside, giving her space to enter without feeling cornered. She crossed the threshold slowly, taking in each corner like someone trying to decide if the silence was real or just an illusion. Rook placed a pot back on the stove. "There's some food left from earlier," he said without looking at her. "It's not much, but it's warm." She didn't respond, but her eyes followed the steam rising from the pot. Hunger pressed on her, but she didn't move. She didn't know if she was even allowed to come closer. Tiva picked up a tin cup, filled it with water, and placed it on the bench. "You can drink," she said simply. "It's clean." Asha accepted the cup carefully. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it to her lips. The first sip eased her breath. The second released the tension in her shoulders. Willa sat on the edge of her bed, watching her quietly, trying to understand how someone could look so strong and so fragile all at once. "What's your name?" she asked softly, as if raising her voice might scare her away. The woman lowered the cup and hesitated before answering. "Asha." Her voice was rough, nearly hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. Rook stirred the beans in the pot. He heard her, but didn't turn around. He didn't want her to feel like she was being examined. He served a portion into a bowl and set it on the table. Not handing it to her, just placing it there. Asha approached only when she was sure no one would rush her, when she understood that the only thing they expected from her was to eat. As she ate, Rook finally allowed himself to really look at her. Her face showed bruises that had started to fade, but they were still there. Her arms bore the fine marks of rope, signs she'd been tied more than once in recent days. Even sitting, her back stayed straight, as if slouching meant surrender. And she couldn't allow that. Rook didn't ask a thing. Not that night. He didn't want to force her to relive whatever she'd been through. The girls settled into their beds. Tiva kept watching her, eyelids drooping, like she was afraid the woman would vanish if she looked away. Willa whispered something to her sister, then pulled the covers up to her chin. Rook stood near the stove, rubbing his hands to draw out what little heat was left. He glanced at Asha's torn clothes, the rip along her shoulder, the way she kept her feet close together to hold on to warmth. He walked to the trunk beside his cot, pulled out a folded wool shawl, and laid it on the corner of the table. "You can use this tonight," he said, with no hint of pressure. "Nights get colder out here." Asha looked at the shawl for a moment, unsure if accepting it would mean she owed something. She didn't understand, and still, when she finally reached for it, she did so slowly, as if afraid the offer might be taken back midway. "You'll sleep over there," Rook added, pointing to the far corner of the cabin where he'd already laid a blanket on the floor. "It's nothing fancy, but it's safe." The word safe changed something in her face. Not relief exactly, but a slight softening around her mouth, a quiet acknowledgement that she understood the difference between a temporary shelter and a place where a person could breathe without fear. Asha sat down on the blanket, adjusting the borrowed shawl. Her eyes made one last sweep across the cabin, The door, the window, the stove, the distance to the girls, as if she needed to map it all before she could let her eyes close. Rook Halden poured himself a little water and stood in the cabin in silence, aware of Asha Redmoon's presence in a way he hadn't expected. Her silence didn't fill the space like a burden. It settled cautiously, not threatening, but not entirely trusting either. Before turning down the lantern, he spoke once more. "No one will hurt you here. That's the only rule in this house." Asha looked up. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased, just barely enough to show she'd heard him, loud and clear. When the light went out, darkness wrapped around them, pierced only by the soft breathing of the girls and the slow creak of the stove. Asha stayed awake for a long time, as always, listening for any sound out of place, out of habit, out of survival. Rook stayed awake a while, too. He heard her shifting, adjusting the blanket, settling into a corner she hadn't asked for, but needed. Neither of them spoke again that night, but the tense silence began to change shape. It was no longer fear. It was something new. A first layer, thin but real, of trust between two strangers who didn't yet know how to ask anything of each other. A pale band of light appeared on the horizon when the silence finally broke. The stove barely held any warmth from the night. The inside of the cabin clung to the chill of dawn, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible the second you exhale. Rook was the first to rise. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who's lived many years alone. No sound, boots slipped on, coat buttoned, eyes checking the stove by routine. From her corner, Asha moved her head slightly. She didn't sit up. Her eyes scanned the room like someone who's spent too many nights in places where sunrise doesn't always mean safety. The blanket had slipped down her back. She pulled it up again, without looking at Rook. He simply nodded, recognizing her alertness without invading it. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The ground crunched beneath his boots. A thin layer of frost covered everything, glinting like glass in the morning light. The horses stood near the fence, breath rising in slow clouds. He walked to the pump and worked the lever until cold water splashed into the metal bucket. His hands burned from the chill, but he didn't stop. He knew the animals needed to drink before the sun climbed any higher. When he came back inside, Willow was already awake, her hair tousled, the blanket still around her shoulders. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward Asha before saying a word. "Did you sleep?" she asked quietly. Asha hesitated for a moment. "A little," she replied. It was a short word, but honest, even surprising to her. It was the first night in weeks she hadn't been tied up, shoved, or forced to run. Tiva woke up next. She sat up in bed, with her feet tucked under her legs. Her eyes scanned the room, saw that Asha was still there, and relaxed. Her relief didn't need words. She got up and went straight to help her father, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Rook set the pot on the stove and poured in water. The crackle of firewood replaced the silence. Asha watched him, not with suspicion, but with focus. She needed to understand how life moved in this place. She didn't know what was expected of her, so she studied every gesture as if it were a clue. She stood slowly, holding the blanket in one hand. Her legs ached. Days of forced walking and hard nights had left their mark. She moved closer to the table, but stayed a few steps back from the stove. Rook noticed and turned just slightly. "You can sit if you want," he said. "The cabin warms up faster if no one's standing by the door." Asha obeyed. She sat in the nearest chair. Smooth wood worn by the years. Her fingers gripped the edge as she adjusted her posture. She didn't want to seem useless, but she also didn't know what she was allowed to touch. Willa brought her a tin cup with warm water. "It helps in the mornings," she said. Asha took it with both hands. The warmth flowed through her fingers. She nodded quietly, grateful, but still without words. Rook watched her from the stove. He saw how she stayed guarded, even in the warmth. The eyes that darted now and then toward the windows, the small, alert movements, like someone still ready to flee if anything felt wrong. Rook Halden didn't tell her again that she was safe. He'd already said it once, and he knew trust couldn't be forced. It's something you build, slowly, and he had no intention of asking her for anything she wasn't ready to give. Breakfast was simple. Oatmeal cooked thick. A meal without words, without ceremony. Tiva Holden swung her legs under the bench, chewing with a lively rhythm. Willa Maddox ate more slowly, never quite taking her eyes off Asha Redmoon, like she was trying to study something in her gestures that she still didn't fully understand. Midway through the meal, Asha set her bowl down on the table and spoke softly. "I can work." Rook looked up. "You don't have to today." She shook her head gently. "I want to help." There was firmness in those words, more than she'd shown the night before. He looked at her for a moment. He understood that need. When everything has been taken from someone, the simple act of having a task can be the first step to reclaiming who they are. "We'll take it slow," he said. "Simple things." Asha nodded once, grateful for being heard, and relieved she hadn't been pushed. After breakfast, the girls bundled up in their coats to go collect eggs from the chicken coop. Asha followed them outside, the shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. In daylight, the yard looked different. Open prairies, soft hills in the distance, a small pen beside the barn. She paused for a few seconds, taking it in, trying to focus on something that didn't feel like a threat. Willa held the chicken coop door open. "Watch your step. The ground's slippery." Asha stepped in carefully, noticing the uneven frost under her boots. Tiva crouched beside the nesting boxes, lifting each egg with a kind of sacred focus. Asha watched them work. She saw how they moved with ease, how they knew the place, how the cold didn't stop them from doing things naturally. For the first time since she arrived, something stirred inside her. A small, quiet certainty. She was in a place where children walked without fear. Rook approached from the barn, a rake in his hand. "The pen could use some cleaning. Only if you feel up to it." Asha nodded. "I can do it." She took the rake, tested the grip in her hands, and walked toward the pen gate. Her steps were slow, but not weak. The cold air sharpened her senses, and having a simple task gave her something she hadn't had in weeks: direction. Rook watched her for a moment from a distance, then returned to his own work. No watching over her. No hovering. As Asha worked, she listened to the sounds around her. The wind moving through dry grass, the clucking of hens, the laughter of the girls at something unexpected, the steady hammering of Rook fixing a loose board. They were new sounds to her, sounds from a place where people lived, without running. When she finished, she leaned on the rake handle to catch her breath. Rook came over, gave her work a quick glance, and said, "You did good. Thank you." His voice carried no judgment, only acknowledgement. Asha straightened, surprised by how much weight two simple words could hold. Before she could answer, Tiva gently tugged at her sleeve. "We want to show you the creek later. It's not far." Asha looked at the girl. Her first instinct was to retreat. Attachment made survival harder. But Tiva's invitation was pure, without pressure. And something inside Asha softened at the thought of walking freely, not being dragged, not being shoved. She nodded slowly. All right. Tiva grinned with her whole face and ran off to tell her sister. Rook watched the moment unfold in silence. He understood more than he let on. Asha wasn't just regaining her strength. She was beginning, without knowing it yet, to let the idea of belonging take root. The morning carried on, and for the first time since she crossed the threshold of that home, Asha felt the weight of fear shift off her chest. Not entirely, but just enough for her to breathe without effort. It wasn't safety she felt. Not yet. It was possibility. Afternoon settled over the Halden Ranch with a soft stillness, like a quiet blanket stretching across the yard and fading into the open fields beyond. The morning frost had melted into thin ribbons of water along the fence posts, and the ground was beginning to soften under the late sun. Rook Halden had just finished tightening a loose shutter on the cabin and set the hammer aside, brushing the dust from his gloves. Then he saw her. Asha Redmoon stood near the corral. Her stance was steady, but uncertain, like someone trying to figure out where they belonged in a place that still didn't feel like theirs. Willa and Tiva were seated on a fallen log a few steps away. They whispered to one another, wondering if Asha might want help with the chores. They wanted to approach her but hesitated, trying to respect boundaries they hadn't yet learned to read. Rook understood that kind of hesitation. He knew trust didn't arrive in a single morning. He walked toward Asha with steady steps, making sure she could hear him coming. She turned her face just enough to acknowledge him, eyes still scanning the yard. "You doing okay?" he asked. She took her time answering. "I can keep working if you need it," she said. "That's not what I asked," Rook replied calmly. "I want to know how you're feeling today." Asha absorbed the question like it was foreign. No one had asked her that in a long time. "I'm adjusting," she said at last. "Your home is quiet." He nodded. "Sometimes quiet takes getting used to, too." She shifted her weight slightly, her gaze drifting to the distant hills. "I haven't spent more than one night in the same place for weeks." "You don't have to leave now," Rook said. "Not unless it's you who decides to." Asha let out a contained breath. She didn't say thank you. She didn't make promises. But something eased in her expression, something small and invisible. She was no longer bracing herself for the next command, no longer standing guard from within. Before either of them could say more, Tiva came running over with a piece of cloth in hand. "Hey, the goat got loose again," she called. "She's in the woodpile." Rook let out a short sigh. That beast never learns. Tiva looked up at Asha. "Will you help me? She listens better when there's more than one of us." Asha glanced at Rook, not asking permission, just looking for understanding. He gave her a small nod. "Go if you feel up to it." Asha followed the girl to the barn. The goat was bleating loudly near the pile of logs, head-butting the wood and knocking things over. Tiva circled around it carefully, forming a little path for Asha to come closer. Asha crouched down slowly, speaking in a low voice that surprised the girl. It was calm, firm. Sure, very different from the silence she had kept before. The goat stopped, ears twitching like it wasn't sure whether to flee or stay. Asha held out her hand, palm open. After a few seconds, the animal stepped toward her. Tiva grinned with pride. "You're good with animals." Asha guided the goat back into the barn and closed the latch securely. "In my tribe, we cared for horses," she said quietly. And dogs. If you give them time, they listen. When she turned around, she saw a rook watching from across the yard. That moment, simple, unforced, told him more about Asha's past than any direct question could. She had lived a life shaped by patience and care, a life defined by responsibility, not fear. Later, while the girls gathered wood for the fire, Rook approached her again. "Want to walk the fence line with me?" he asked. "Last week's storm loosened part of the east side. I could use another pair of eyes." Asha hesitated. She wasn't sure if stepping away from the cabin, her immediate refuge, was a good idea. Rook noticed her hesitation and added gently, "We won't go far." "We'll stay on the ranch the whole time," Rook Halden said. Asha Redmoon gave one firm nod. "I can walk," she answered without hesitation. They walked side by side toward the far edge of the field, keeping a respectful distance between them. The dry grass brushed against their boots, and the wind carried a faint scent of pine down from the ridges. They didn't speak for several minutes, but the silence didn't feel heavy. It was the silence of learning, of two people just beginning to figure out how to be near each other without causing harm. Rook walked along the fence, checking it as they went. A few posts leaned from the storm's force, but most held firm. Asha watched him closely, studying how his hands inspected each section with calm, unhurried movements. "You built all this?" she asked softly. "Most of it," he replied. "Neighbors helped with the first stretch. After my wife passed, I finished the rest on my own." She absorbed that answer with a slow blink. Grief had marked him, too, though he carried it differently than she did. His was quiet, folded into routine. Hers still sat close to the surface, raw and unguarded. When they reached one of the loose posts, Rook gave it a shove to test its hold. It wobbled, but didn't fall. "I'll reinforce it tomorrow," he said. "It won't go down before then." Asha touched the wood with her fingertips. Her hands were calloused, weathered. Not soft hands. "I can help you with that," she offered. "Only if you want to," he answered. "You don't have to earn your right to stay." She looked at him, confused. "The men in the caravan said otherwise." "I'm not them," Rook said. "No drama, no edge, just truth." Asha lowered her hand from the post and looked toward the cabin. Willa and Tiva were stacking firewood in a crooked little pile. She watched them with a mix of caution and tenderness, as if she still didn't know whether she was allowed to get close, but wanted to understand how belonging worked. On the walk back, Asha noticed something different in her body, a soft change. She hadn't looked over her shoulder the whole way, hadn't listened for threats, hadn't thought about where to run if things went wrong. For the first time, her body had allowed a small break from survival mode. Inside the cabin, the girls folded her in with ease. Tiva handed her a small tin bowl. Willa pointed to the dry beans on the counter. "We make stew on days when Dad works late," she explained. "Want to help stir?" Asha took the wooden spoon. It was a simple gesture, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt she wasn't on the outside. She was part of the rhythm of that home. She stirred slowly, watching the mixture thicken. The bubbling sounds filled the room with something that had no name, but felt like presence. Rook stepped in minutes later, pulling off his coat as he crossed the doorway. He looked toward the stove. Asha dropped her gaze, unsure if she'd overstepped by joining in the cooking. "You did good," he said. "Stew thickens better if you stir it early." Asha's shoulders eased. Tiva beamed with pride. Willa passed out cups of water. They ate together at the small table. No one asked Asha where she'd come from. No one asked what she'd lost. The silence didn't demand. It gave room. Rook watched her eat slowly, like someone relearning how to let their body find its rhythm after too many days of emptiness. When dinner ended, Asha helped rinse the bowls in the basin. No one asked her to. She did it gently, quietly. The girls whispered to each other, enchanted by the soft melody she hummed without meaning to. It wasn't a song with words. It was something born from within, instinctive. Rook went out to check on the animals before nightfall. Asha followed him to the door, but stopped just short of crossing the threshold. "I can help you tomorrow," said Asha Red Moon, her voice steady. "With whatever you need." Rook Halden looked at her closely. She wasn't speaking from fear. She wasn't trying to earn her place. She was choosing to take part in a small, simple life. A life she hadn't expected to find. "We'll figure it out together," he said. Asha closed the door softly. Inside, the girls had already laid out a blanket for her in the corner. Neater than the night before. She stood looking at the gentle folds, unsure how to accept such simple kindness. For the first time since the raid that shattered her world, she felt her chest ease. Not completely. Not forever. But enough to fill her lungs without pain. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like the beginning of something she'd never dared to imagine. The sun rose through a thin layer of mist, bathing the yard in soft light that blurred the hard lines of the fence and the roof shingles. Rook stepped outside early, his breath visible in the cold air. The ground had stiffened overnight, leaving a brittle crust that cracked beneath his boots. He checked the horses first, brushed frost off their backs, adjusted the feeder straps. The animals snorted softly, recognizing his calm presence. Inside the cabin, Asha folded the blanket she had used with great care. She smoothed out the edges like she wanted to make sure no trace was left out of place. She'd slept off and on, waking up with a start more than once at small sounds. Habit. But she had rested better than she expected. The girls were still fast asleep. One curled up toward the wall, the other with an arm flung out from under the covers. She stood there watching them a moment. They looked so at peace that a tightness caught in her throat. She pulled the shawl over her shoulders and stepped out into the yard. The cold hit instantly, but she welcomed it. It kept her alert. She scanned the land out of instinct. Barn door shut, corral secured, no strangers in sight. Only after confirming everything was as it should be did she walk toward Rook. He noticed her coming, but didn't stop brushing the horse. "Morning," he said, flicking a loose strand of mane from his glove. "I slept enough," she replied calmly. He gave a small nod, asking nothing more. He understood the difference between resting and feeling safe. "I'm checking the west pasture today," he said. "The fence runs long. It'll take a couple hours." Asha studied the way he moved, how he leaned his shoulder into adjusting a strap. "Need help?" she asked. "Only if you feel up for it. It's a long walk." "I can handle long walks," she said, soft but steady. And he believed her, because the strength beneath her quiet was unmistakable. Seconds later, the girls came running out with their coats half-buttoned. Willa carried a wooden bucket. Tiva held 2 small cloth bundles. "We packed food for the walk," Tiva announced proudly. Asha blinked, surprised they'd included her as part of the plan. Willa held out the bucket. "You can carry it if you want. It's not heavy." Asha hesitated a moment, then took it. It wasn't the weight that hit her. It was the quiet assumption that she belonged enough to carry their things. Rook noticed her pause, but said nothing. They left the yard at a slow, steady pace. Rook led, eyes on the ground, alert for tracks or animal signs. Asha stayed beside the girls, matching her steps to Tiva's shorter stride. The land opened wide before them. Clear plains, patches of dry brush, the distant silhouette of low hills. The wind carried a clean scent, sharp and fresh, mixed with the earth beneath their boots. As they walked, Willa pointed to a trail of rabbit prints leading toward a burrow. "Dad says those marks mean they were running." Asha crouched to get a closer look. The spacing between the tracks was uneven, the angle slanted. "They were being chased," she said quietly. "Something startled them," said Asha Red Moon. "Coyotes?" Tiva asked, eyes wide. "Could be," Asha answered. "Or a hill dog." The girls were amazed. Rook Halden, who had been listening from a few yards behind, let a faint smile loosen the corner of his mouth. Asha's skills were becoming more and more evident. She wasn't loud, but she was sharp, practical, shaped by a life that had taught her to read the land like an open book. They reached the first section of fence. The post stood solid, and the wire was tight. Rook ran his palm along the top beam, feeling for any shift. Asha watched his method closely. He spoke in a low voice, assuming neither that she knew nor that she didn't. "Snow puts weight on the wire," he said. "When it melts in the spring, it can pull the posts loose." Asha nodded, running her hand along the wood too, feeling how the weather had worn it down. "We used to check the fences every season," she said. "My family fixed the breaks before they got worse." Rook paused. "You lived near the hills?" "North of here. Past the ridge," she replied. "Not anymore." He didn't press further. The way she said it was enough. A clear, drawn line that didn't need more questions. The next section showed signs of damage. Some strong gust had loosened one side. Rook crouched down to tighten the lower wire. Asha set the bucket aside and squatted next to him. She studied his grip, then placed her hands nearby to help brace the wire more firmly. Rook glanced at her sideways. "You know how to fix fences?" "Yes," she replied. She pressed her weight against the post to keep it in place while he worked. Everyone worked. No one was too young or too old. Their hands brushed as they passed the tool. It was brief, unintentional, but both paused for a second. Rook cleared his throat subtly and went on tightening the wire. Asha pretended not to notice the shift in her chest. The girls had wandered off a bit, picking smooth stones from the dirt as if they were little treasures. They laughed. Their voices floated across the field naturally, without fear. When they finished, Rook stood up with a long breath. "Good work," he told Asha. She didn't reply, but her shoulders lifted slightly. She'd heard him. They walked deeper into the pasture as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The land stretched open like an ocean of dry grass and scattered sagebrush. A hawk soared overhead. Its shadow passed briefly across their boots. At a narrow bend in the fence, Rook came to a sudden stop. "Tracks," he murmured. Asha crouched beside him. A series of deep footprints crossed the field, so clearly marked the grass had been pressed flat. Her pulse tightened. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Several sets, boots, heading toward the ranch. "When?" she whispered. "Hard to say," Rook replied, studying the depth and dryness of the soil. "Maybe a day, or less." The girls were coming closer, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. "Did you find something?" Willa asked. Rook kept his tone calm. "Just some tracks, nothing to worry about." But Asha knew. Their eyes met. She read in his look a quiet caution he didn't say aloud. She had traveled enough to recognize the path of men who didn't carry good intentions. Rook lowered his voice. "We'll finish up quick and head back." Asha nodded. From that moment, their pace changed. The tension was there, unspoken. Asha scanned every rise, every cluster of brush. She measured distances, angles, in case something appeared. Rook walked closer to the girls. His hand reached toward the rifle slung across his back more than once. By noon, they reached the creek that marked the edge of the property. The water was clear but shallow. The girls knelt at the bank, touching the icy surface with their fingers. Tiva waited for Asha to join her. She knelt beside her, dipping her hand into the water. The cold numbed her skin instantly, but she didn't pull away. She watched as the current carried specks of soil downstream. The creek reminded her of another place, another morning. From before the raid, a flash of pain crossed her face. Willa noticed. She didn't ask anything. She just moved close until her shoulder brushed Asha's arm. The touch startled her, but she didn't pull away. The silent presence of the girl steadied her more than any words could have. Rook Halden watched from a few steps behind. That small, quiet moment settled something deep within him. Asha Redmoon wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to open herself to the girls, even if she didn't know it yet. They had lunch from what the girls had packed themselves, bits of bread, dried apple, and a strip of jerky shared among them. Asha ate slowly now. She no longer rushed, no longer guarded her food like it might vanish without warning. When they finished, Rook stood up. "We should head back," he said. "I want to check those tracks again from the ridge." Asha rose at once. Alertness returned to her body. The calm of the creek couldn't erase the possibility of danger. Their pace on the return was quicker. The wind had picked up, pulling threads of dust across the fields in soft waves. The cabin appeared in the distance, small but sturdy against the gusts. When they reached the yard, Asha paused. She checked everything again. The door latch, the closed windows, not a single unfamiliar footprint near the entry. Only then did her shoulders relax, just a little. The girls ran ahead, laughing, racing to see who would reach the porch first. Rook removed his gloves and turned to Asha. "We'll talk about those tracks later," he said quietly. "Not in front of them." Asha nodded. "I want to help." "If someone's nearby," he added, "I need to know." "You will," she answered, meeting his eyes. "Keep me informed. I'm not outside this." The words settled between them with a calm weight. They weren't romantic or grand. They were honest. And to Asha, that inclusion meant more than any promise. Inside the cabin, the stove sparked back to life. The girls chattered excitedly about the stones they had found. Afternoon light streamed through the small window, warming the wooden floor. Asha stood by the doorway, watching the scene. Feeling again something move inside her. Something unfamiliar, but steady. For the first time since she lost her family, she understood that her presence here wasn't temporary. Not forced, not barely tolerated. It was welcome. That night, the wind changed. It swept across the plains with a dry force, kicking up dust, brittle leaves, and a distant scent of smoke. By dawn, Rook sensed it in the air. It wasn't the usual cold. It was a different kind of tension. He rose without a sound, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside before the first light touched the ridge. The horses shifted restlessly, ears turned west. Even the chickens stayed close to the coop, more still than usual. Rook stopped. He listened, and the land replied, with silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence that watched. Inside, Asha was already seated near the stove, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders, getting ready to help with breakfast. Her eyes followed him the moment he stepped through the door. She read things in him others might miss. The stiffness in his shoulders. The way he didn't take off his coat. How he checked every window before he said a word. "You saw something," she said, without raising her voice. "Some signs," Rook replied. "Tracks yesterday, and the wind. It's carrying smoke from where it shouldn't be." Asha's posture tensed. "Could be travelers." "Could be," he said. "Or not." The girls woke up a few minutes later, unaware of the shift in the room. Tiva rubbed her eyes and asked what chores they had for the day. Willa, quicker to sense things, was already buttoning her coat without a word. She felt something had changed between the adults, though she didn't know what. Rook spoke calmly. "We're staying close to the house today. There's work to do right here." Asha caught the real meaning beneath his words. He didn't want the girls wandering off. And she understood why. Asha Redmoon gave a single nod, silently acknowledging the unspoken plan beginning to form between them. After breakfast, Rook Halden took the rifle down from the wall and set it beside the door. He didn't do it with haste or alarm, but with the careful presence of a man who knew the weight of risk. Asha watched him closely. She remembered men who carried guns with arrogance, but Rook wasn't one of them. His presence was steady, responsible. He didn't carry a weapon to impress or intimidate. The girls bundled up and went out to the yard to feed the chickens. Asha followed, breathing in the cold air, focusing on the tasks of the day. But she also felt what he felt, a restlessness in the land. Her clan had taught her how to read shifts in nature, how to notice when things changed without visible cause. While scattering grain across the ground, she noticed something. Footprints near the fence. They hadn't been there the day before. Shallow, but fresh. They weren't theirs. Her pulse spiked instantly. She crouched down, studying them carefully. Willa saw her kneeling, focused. "More tracks?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Asha nodded without taking her eyes off the ground. "They're not your father's. Or yours." Willa swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she should yell. Asha stood slowly and stepped between the tracks and the girls. "Go inside," she said gently. "Help get the fire going." They didn't argue. They ran for the cabin. Asha followed, but didn't go in. She stood on the porch, waiting. When Rook came back out, one look at Asha's face was all it took. He walked toward the fence without needing an explanation. She pointed to the ground. "Fresh," she said. Rook examined the tracks. His jaw tightened. 3 men. Maybe 4. "How close?" Asha asked. "Close enough that everyone stays inside today." Asha didn't argue. She knew well what it meant to have unseen visitors that near an isolated ranch. "Are they watching?" she asked in a low voice. "Hard to say," he replied. "But they were heading toward the ridge. That's enough to keep me alert." Asha took a deep breath, letting the information settle. She'd lived through enough danger to know that caution could save a life. They returned to the cabin. The girls were waiting by the stove. Rook spoke in a calm tone. "We're working indoors today. No going outside, understood?" Tiva nodded right away. Willa hesitated a moment, but then agreed as well. Asha took charge of preparing the house for a long day. She checked the water barrel, stacked more firewood near the stove, swept the dirt from the wooden floor, and set the blankets within reach. She moved with silent precision. Instinctive. She was securing that home the same way she used to secure her camp. Rook watched her. Not with possession. not with suspicion, with gratitude. He'd spent years alone, making every choice without help. Now, having someone who recognized danger and responded without fear lightened a burden he hadn't even realized he still carried. As the morning wore on, the wind turned sharper. Loose boards in the roof creaked, the horses stamped and snorted. Dust swept across the yard like thin sheets of sand. Asha sat near the window, watching the hills. She knew how to read silhouettes from afar, how to tell a rock from a man, how to study the flight of birds when something was coming. Rook joined her, handing her a cup of warm water. "Anything?" he asked. "No movement. Yet," she replied. The girls were drawing at the table and, now and then, ran to show her their pictures. Asha looked at each one with patience, answering with a kind word or a gentle nod. Despite the tension, she returned tenderness to them. But near midday, a sound cut through the hush of the wind. A distant crack, sharp, dry, too clear. Asha stood immediately. Her whole body went taut. Rook grabbed the rifle and stepped to the door. "What was that?" Willa whispered. "A branch," Rook said, though his voice held doubt. Asha shook her head. "It wasn't a branch." Something hit the wood. Rook Halden glanced at Asha Redmoon. He trusted her hearing. He opened the door slowly and scanned the yard. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. No figure broke the line of the horizon. He closed the door and slid the bolt shut. The girls said nothing. They felt it, like cold in the bones, that this wasn't the kind of fear you spoke of out loud. Asha stepped closer to Rook. "Tell me what you're thinking." "There's someone out there," he admitted in a low voice. "Might be hunters, might be drifters, but they're too close for comfort." "We need to prepare," she said. "For what?" "For whatever comes." Rook didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a small hatchet he kept by the woodpile. Asha accepted it with both hands. She understood exactly what that gesture meant. Trust, alliance, shared responsibility. The afternoon dragged on, tense and heavy. Asha and Rook took turns at the window every half hour. The girls stayed close to the stove, whispering to each other, stealing nervous glances toward the door. When the sun vanished behind the hills, the wind died down. The stillness that followed was unsettling. Every sound inside the cabin seemed louder. Asha stood firm, her gaze fixed on a distant point. Rook stood beside her, rifle resting on his shoulder. The minutes passed as if they carried weight. Then, footsteps, soft, cautious, close to the porch, not many. 2, maybe 3. Asha tightened her grip on the hatchet. Rook raised the rifle. The steps stopped. A voice called from outside, low, uncertain. "Is anyone home?" Rook and Asha exchanged a glance. Calm, sharp, ready. The quiet days that had wrapped Asha in warmth and safety were gone. And the quiet life Rook had built was about to be tested. The voice outside fell silent. And everything inside did too. Tiva clung to Willa, eyes wide, unsure whether to hide or stay still. Willa wrapped an arm around her and gently pulled her behind the table. The stove creaked once. The sound was too loud. In that moment, silence was a shield. Rook raised one finger, signaling Asha to hold steady. She already was. Breath held. Feet planted. Eyes locked on the door, unblinking. The voice came again, closer now. "Saw smoke. Thought someone might give me directions." Rook didn't answer right away. He knew men who truly needed help didn't approach a country cabin at dusk. Their voices didn't sound like that. He had 2 choices: respond and reveal. There were girls inside, or stay silent and seem suspicious. He chose control. "Stay where you are," he said, voice firm. "Who's out there?" Pause. "Name's Turner. Got 2 others with me." A cough. "Hunters. Lost our way." Asha shifted slightly, just enough for Rook to catch the edge of her profile. The tension in her jaw told him everything. She didn't believe a word. Hunters didn't move in groups of 3 that close to settled land. Not without dogs, not without gear, not without announcing themselves ahead of time. Rook positioned himself beside the door, ready to fire if it came to that. He didn't want violence. Not in front of the girls, not in front of a woman like Asha, who'd seen more than her share. But he wouldn't let anyone walk in without resistance. "What do you want?" Rook asked. "It's already night, not the time for visiting." "We're cold," the man answered. "Not asking for much, just a little warmth. Some water." A soft creak followed. Boots on hard ground. They'd moved closer. Rook recognized that kind of step. Men who don't want to startle, but do want to intimidate with their nearness. Asha moved to the window. She pulled the curtain back just slightly, just enough to see without being seen. She studied the figures outside. 3. Their shoulders leaned inward, hands near their coats where weapons might be. "They're lying," she whispered. Rook nodded once. He opened the door just a crack, letting the rifle show. The cold rushed in hard, dragging with it dust and the sour scent of sweat and old tobacco. Turner was closer now. Tall, wearing a heavy coat, an unkempt beard, and eyes that never stopped scanning the cabin's interior. The 2 men with him kept their hands low. Not threatening, but not relaxed either. "Lost, huh?" Rook said firmly. Turner forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It snowed 2 nights ago, covered our trail," Turner said with a false voice. "Didn't snow here," Rook Halden replied. Turner's fake smile faded. His eyes hardened. "Look, friend, we're just trying to survive." Rook stepped out farther, positioning himself so the men couldn't see into the cabin. "You got a camp?" "No." "Horses?" "Close by." Rook tightened his grip on the rifle. "You're not staying here." Turner stepped forward. "Not even for a little water?" "You heard me," Rook said. "Keep walking." The 2 men behind Turner exchanged glances, muttered something under their breath. One shifted sideways, casting a glance too interested in the cabin. Turner followed his gaze. "You got folks inside?" he asked, feigning curiosity, but the look in his eyes gave away a different intent. Rook didn't answer. The silence said enough. Turner's eyes narrowed. "I heard voices," he pressed. "Keep walking," Rook warned. Inside the cabin, Asha Redmoon held the hatchet hidden behind her leg. Ready to move the second something shifted. She saw Tiva trembling behind the table and stepped in front of her, positioning her body to shield the child if the men tried to come through. Asha's heart beat with a tense, measured rhythm. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. She'd faced danger before. This time she wouldn't run. Turner tried once more. "Cold night to be stubborn," he said. Rook lifted the barrel of the rifle slightly. "Cold night to make a mistake." The standoff stretched like a taut rope. The wind kicked up dust around their boots. The sky dimmed, fading from blue to ash. The tension between them all was thick. All it would take was for someone to make the first move. Finally, Turner muttered, "We're not looking for trouble. Just remember we asked polite." He took a step back. The others followed, their figures fading into the dark edge of the field. Rook didn't lower the rifle until the silhouettes disappeared beyond the fence. Asha closed the curtains. Her chest rose and fell once, slow, deep, measured. It wasn't relief. It was calculation. Rook locked the door and turned towards the girls. "You all right?" Willa nodded, still clutching her sister's hand. Tiva whispered, "Are they coming back?" Rook crouched down to her level. "Not tonight, but we'll stay watchful." The girls hugged him briefly before moving toward the stove, looking for warmth and for routine. Asha stayed by the door, her eyes fixed on Rook. She saw the slight tremble in his left hand, the one he thought he'd hidden. "They weren't lost," she said. "I know," he answered. "They were looking for something, a place to take from." Rook exhaled slowly. They saw this wouldn't be easy. "Maybe that'll drive them off," she said. "Maybe not," Asha replied, steady. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Rook spoke first. "We'll get ready. Nothing will happen in this house while I still breathe." Asha's expression shifted. A flicker of doubt, a touch of respect, and something deeper. "I'll help," she said. "I won't let them near the girls." "I know," he said. And he meant it. She read the truth in his words, and leaned on it. The rest of the afternoon passed with purpose. Rook reinforced the doorframe with some boards he kept behind the cabin. Asha Redmoon moved a chair under the window to watch the yard without being seen. Willa and Tiva filled water jugs, stacked blankets, and whispered instructions to each other like two little soldiers set on doing their part. Rook Halden lit a second lamp, but turned the wick low. Too much light would cast silhouettes. Too little would blind them. He checked the rifle, loading each chamber carefully, and left it within reach. Asha watched every movement he made, understanding exactly what they meant. This wasn't fear, it was memory, the actions of a man who had known violence and refused to let its shadow fall near his daughters. A rare certainty formed in her. She belonged in this moment, inside that protective circle. Not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who would stand between danger and those girls. When the little ones finally fell asleep, curled together in the same bed, Asha took the first watch by the window. Rook sat at the table, listening to the silence outside. Hours passed. The land remained still. But the stillness didn't erase the truth. Someone had found the ranch. Someone had tested its defenses. And someone, sooner or later, would return. As the lamplight flickered, Asha remembered the day her world was burned down. The smoke, the screams, the feeling of being hunted through the trees. She gripped the hatchet tighter in her hands. This home wouldn't end the same way, not while she breathed, not while she had strength. And across the room, Rook was thinking the same. They were no longer two strangers facing uncertainty. They were two people willing to fight, back to back. The night stretched long, wrapping the cabin in a suspended quiet neither Asha nor Rook dared to trust. Outside, the wind had stilled. Too much. The animals in the pen were huddled together, their shapes barely visible in the glow seeping through the curtains. Not even the distant howls of coyotes could be heard, as if the wild creatures sensed something moving beyond their bounds. Asha stayed at the window, eyes locked on the fence. The hatchet lay across her lap, balanced. She had taken watch without protest, had insisted Rook rest, at least for a while, but he hadn't slept. He'd only pretended, for the girls. The floor creaked softly as he rose and crossed the room, stopping behind her. "You should sit down," she whispered without turning. "Your shoulders are tight." They always get that way before the weather changes, he replied. Not because of the weather. I can hold the watch, she added. Nothing slips past me. Rook sat in the chair beside hers. Then we'll watch together. She didn't argue. The silence between them was steady. It wasn't for comfort. It was for purpose. Rook scanned the land. Asha listened. She focused on the smallest sounds. A branch snapping, fabric brushing, boots sinking into dirt. Her breath was even, her gaze sharp, disciplined. After several minutes, Rook asked the question he'd been holding back for hours. You read those men the moment they spoke. How? Asha didn't take her eyes off the darkness. Those who come to harm can't hide it. They move too slow. Their eyes move too fast. They keep their hands near their weapons. And they take too much interest in homes where women and children live. Rook took a long pause before responding. You learned that young. Too young, she answered. Bandits came through our land when I was a girl. My parents taught me to read the signs. Her voice hardened. The ones today, they weren't looking for shelter. They were scouting. Rook let out a slow breath. I know they'll come back, she added. Maybe not tonight. Maybe when the moon turns. But they'll return, because they saw something they think they can take. Rook's jaw clenched. Let them try. Asha looked at him for a moment. She read the weight behind his voice. You've got little girls, she said. Your duty is to them first. And to anyone standing with us, he added. Rook Halden's words caught Asha Redmoon by surprise. She turned back to the window, refusing to let emotion distract her watch. Still, something shifted inside her, something steady, unfamiliar, and to her surprise, warm. The hours crawled on, the lamp dimmed, shadows danced along the walls as the stove's coals faded to a dull glow. The cold started to creep in through the floorboards, but neither of them moved. At one point, Asha leaned forward, narrowing her eyes toward a dark patch beyond the barn. There's something there, she whispered. Rook gripped the rifle and followed her gaze. The shape was hard to make out. Too still to be a man, too large to be a loose animal. He waited, holding his breath. A moment later, the figure shifted, revealing a fallen tree branch resting against the fence. Rook lowered the rifle with a slow, measured exhale. Asha released her breath too, though hers carried the weight of frustration. My mind sees danger in every shadow, she said, voice tight. That's not a flaw, he replied. It's what's kept you alive. Asha closed her eyes for a moment. The fatigue showed in the slight slump of her shoulders. I don't know how to stop looking for threats, not even here. You don't have to, Rook said. Not now. Not while there's still reason to stay alert. She opened her eyes and looked at him for the first time in hours. In that brief exchange, something passed between them that needed no words. Recognition, respect, a shared understanding that survival had shaped them both. Finally, the first sign of dawn appeared as a gray line behind the ridge. Light began to peel back the yard's shadows, making the shapes clearer. Asha straightened, adjusting her grip on the hatchet. Rook stood and went to check the door. The cabin felt less oppressive now that the dark was starting to retreat. We should check before the girls wake, Asha said. We will, Rook replied. Quietly. They stepped out as the sky began to lighten. Frost covered the ground in uneven patches. Rook scanned the soil with a practiced eye. Asha walked ahead, her steps measured, her eyes sharp. She stopped suddenly. Here, she said, pointing to a narrow line beside the barn. Rook knelt beside her. The tracks were shallow but clear, boot marks in soft earth where the frost had thinned. He touched one with 2 fingers. "They're not ours." "No," Asha confirmed. "They were made after Turner left. 2 sets, one with smaller steps trailing the deeper ones." "Are you sure?" Rook asked. "Yes," she said. "The smaller ones hesitate. The heavier ones are steady. Someone was pushing the other forward." Rook felt a chill settle in his gut. It wasn't uncommon for bandits to force others to scout for them. That meant planning. It meant they'd be coming back. "Look at the direction," Asha added. She pointed toward a gap between 2 hills. "They went that way. Far enough to see the cabin. Far enough to see us." Rook straightened. "We need to prepare the girls." Asha tensed slightly, but he cut in. Gently, not harsh. "If trouble comes, we face it together." She looked at him, trying to understand where that kind of certainty came from. "Why do you trust me?" "Because you stayed awake all night to protect 2 girls who aren't yours," he said. "Because you didn't run when danger showed up. Because you're stronger than you think." His honesty hit deeper than she expected. She looked away. She didn't know how to carry the weight of those words. No man had ever said anything like that to her. Inside the cabin, the girls were starting to stir. Tiva rubbed her eyes, still unaware of the threat beyond the walls. Willa stretched and looked toward the adults, sensing the thickness in the air. "Is something wrong?" Willa asked. Rook sat down beside her. "Nothing you need to fear. But today, we stay close." Willa nodded, trusting him without question. Tiva climbed into Asha's lap without asking. She rested her head on her shoulder. The gesture caught Asha by surprise. But then she softened and placed a hand on the girl's back. Later, while the girls ate breakfast inside the cabin, Rook Halden and Asha Redmoon stepped back outside. The sun was fully up now, revealing the vast stretch of dry land. The silence felt less threatening, but both of them knew the danger had already left its mark. Rook was the first to break the quiet. "If they come back, it'll be from the west." "Then we watch that side," Asha replied firmly. "We plan escape routes, we keep the girls close, and we make sure they know this house isn't easy to approach." Rook studied her face. There was strength and weariness in it. But beneath both, something new. Determination. "You're not running?" he asked. "Not anymore," Asha answered, without hesitation. Rook nodded slowly. "Good." Asha looked out across the plains. The wind moved the dry grass in soft waves. Her voice dropped, like the words were hard to say. "Rook, if something happens, you protect the girls first." "And you?" he asked quietly. "I know how to survive," she said. "I won't fall easy." Rook stepped closer. His voice was steady, direct. "I'm not leaving you behind. Not in a fight. You need to understand that." Asha held her breath. Not from fear, but from the strange, unfamiliar weight of someone choosing to stand beside her. Before she could respond, the horses in the corral began to stir nervously, their ears turned toward the horizon. Asha and Rook followed their gaze. Dust was rising from the ridge. It wasn't wind, it was movement. Asha's fingers tightened around the hatchet. Rook gripped the rifle. It was no longer a question of if. The danger was here, and what happened next would forever change this fragile family. Just beginning to take shape. The dust along the ridge grew denser, and the figures within it began to take shape. Rook raised the rifle to his shoulder, adjusting his stance to see better without revealing his outline. Asha stood beside him, steady, composed, jaw tight, breathing even, eyes unblinking. The cold wind carried the scent of churned-up earth and stale sweat. The men appeared one by one. First Turner, then the taller one, and finally, the thin man, dragging a few steps behind. This time they came mounted. That meant they had regrouped. That they had planned their return. Turner's posture had changed. He no longer feigned weakness. Now confidence was drawn across his shoulders. His gaze swept the property with the cold calculation of a man deciding how hard the fight would be. Rook stepped down from the porch without saying a word. He didn't shout. He didn't offer to negotiate. He placed himself in the middle of the yard, fully visible. Making it clear he was waiting for them, Asha stayed at the corner of the cabin, close enough to cover him, but hidden enough that the men couldn't count how many stood ready to defend this home. She glanced toward the windows. Willa and Tiva watched from behind the curtains. Pale, but not afraid. They trusted. Turner pulled his horse to a stop. He raised one hand, as if that gesture might soften his approach. "Good morning, Halden," he called out. "We left a conversation unfinished last night." "You finished it," Rook replied. "I told you to leave." Turner feigned disappointment. "I thought maybe you'd had a change of heart. You've got supplies, livestock, shelter. Winters out here are rough. Sharing makes sense." Rook kept the rifle low, but ready. "Your needs aren't my responsibility." Turner chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not asking permission." Asha tensed. The other two men edged apart slightly, forming a curve around Rook, waiting for a signal, a gesture from Turner. One wrong move from Rook. Anything. But Asha knew how to read the space between men, not just where they stood, but how they intended to move. The tall one had his boots angled toward the barn. The thin one couldn't stop eyeing the window where the girls were. She tightened her grip on the hatchet. Brig Nolan's horse pawed at the dirt, restless from the tension radiating off its rider. Rook Halden didn't move. "Turn around and leave," he said, voice steady. "You won't get another warning." Brig leaned forward in the saddle. "There's 3 of us. You're alone. That's your mistake." "He's not alone," Asha Redmoon cut in, stepping out from the corner with the hatchet in hand, pointed at the ground, but without question, ready. Brig blinked, surprised. "Well now, the lady speaks." "She's defending this home," Rook said, eyes never leaving his mark. Brig studied Asha with a different kind of interest. "Is she the reason you think you're brave now?" Rook didn't react, but Asha caught the subtle twitch of irritation he masked beneath his usual calm. So she stepped closer, standing shoulder to shoulder beside him. She said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. The gesture spoke for itself. Brig snorted. "I tried to be polite, but there's too much here for me to walk away empty-handed." He raised his hand. The tall man spurred his horse toward the barn. The thin one dismounted and advanced on foot, heading straight for the cabin. He was going for the girls. Asha was the first to move. She ran at the thin man with a speed that caught him off guard. That single moment of hesitation cost him dearly. She struck him with the blunt side of the hatchet across the arm. The weapon he was trying to draw dropped to the ground with a dull thud. Asha kicked it aside and stepped between him and the door. Frustrated, the man lunged at her. But Asha sidestepped, used his momentum, and sent him sprawling into the mud. He hit the ground hard, palms scraped and stinging. Asha raised the hatchet again. Not to kill, but to make it absolutely clear he wasn't getting back up. Don't move, she warned. He didn't. Meanwhile, Rook was facing Brig, who was already raising his revolver. The tall man was circling the barn, unsure whether to charge or fall back. Rook didn't lower the rifle. He held it steady, eyes locked on his opponent. "If you fire," he said calmly, "you won't get a second chance." Brig hesitated. Rook's voice didn't waver. It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. "Let's settle this, one-on-one," Brig growled. "There's nothing to settle," Rook replied. "Turn around and go." Brig squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked the air like thunder. The bullet tore through Rook's coat, ripping the fabric, but not the flesh. Rook fired back without hesitation. He aimed for the hand. The shot was clean. Brig's revolver flew from his grip, landing several feet away. The man screamed, clutching his wounded hand. His horse reared, panicked, and threw him to the ground. He landed hard, the air driven from his lungs. The tall man saw it all. He yanked his horse to a stop. His confidence crumbled. He looked at his fallen leader. He looked at Asha, solid as stone, not trembling. "This ain't worth it," he muttered under his breath. He kicked his mount and galloped off without another glance. The thin man, still sprawled in the dirt, raised both hands, his eyes wide as dinner plates. Okay, I'm done. Don't hit me again." Asha didn't blink. "You're not coming back." "I swear, never," he stammered, nodding frantically. Rook walked over to Brig, who was still spitting dirt and rage. "You're a damn fool," the wounded man snarled. "You'll lose everything someday." Rook lowered the rifle. "Maybe, but not today. And not because of you." Brig turned his eyes toward Asha, dripping with contempt. "You'll regret crossing me. Sooner or later he'll pay the price." But Asha stepped forward, her voice low and steady. "I've survived worse men than you, and I don't run anymore." Brig's expression cracked. That false bravado broke like a mask torn in half. What remained beneath was fear. Real. Raw. Rook grabbed him by the collar of his coat and hauled him upright. "Take your friend and get out. If either of you comes back, I won't aim for the hand." The thin man stumbled as he helped Brig Nolan mount his horse. Within seconds, both were galloping over the crest, leaving behind a trail of dust and humiliation. When the last shadow of the horses disappeared into the hills, Asha Redmoon lowered the hatchet. Her hands trembled for the first time since the danger began. Not from weakness, but from the sudden flood of knowing it was over. Rook Halden stepped beside her. "You were right." She nodded, swallowing hard. "And you?" He touched the torn fabric on his coat. "Just grazed the cloth. Nothing more." Relief surged through her so fast she nearly collapsed, but she steadied herself before her knees could give out. The girls burst out from the cabin. Tiva was the first to wrap her arms around Asha, burying her face against her stomach. "I saw him fall," she whispered. "You made him stop." Willa ran straight into Rook, throwing her arms around him, patting his coat like she was checking for wounds. Asha knelt down, pulling Tiva close. The little girl's body still trembled with leftover fear. Asha held her firmly but gently, grounding both of them. Rook rested a hand on Willa's back. "It's over," he murmured. "You're safe." The girls clung to the ones who had protected them, their trust intact. Deep. Absolute. As the shaking faded, Rook and Asha stood together in the middle of the yard. The danger had passed, and the land felt different. Lighter. Clearer. As if the ranch itself had exhaled. Rook looked at her. "You didn't have to stay with us," he said. Asha met his gaze. There was something new in her eyes. Steady. Warm. "This is my home now," she said softly. "Where else would I be?" Rook absorbed her words slowly, as if afraid they might break if he rushed them. Then he held out his hand. Not forcefully, not unsure, just with that quiet honesty that said everything he hadn't spoken. And she took it. The girls watched them, and they smiled. That kind of smile only children have, when they understand something important has changed forever. That night, the four of them sat together near the stove. There were no shadows left, no fear. For the first time since Asha arrived, the cabin felt whole. Not because the danger was gone, but because they had faced it, together. When the girls had fallen asleep, Rook looked at her through the soft flicker of the firelight. The tension in her shoulders was gone. Her breathing was steady. Calm. He spoke softly. Stay. Not out of fear, not out of duty. Stay, because this life is yours too. Asha stepped toward him until she stood within reach. I choose this home, she said. I choose you. I choose the girls. Rook nodded, a rare emotion crossing his otherwise quiet face. Then, let's build something together. She rested her forehead against his. It wasn't a gesture of romance. It was a gesture of trust, a promise, spoken without words. They stayed like that for several long seconds, not speaking, not moving. Outside, the wind brought only calm. No threat on the horizon, no strangers roaming the land. The ranch stood quiet, strong, and claimed. Inside, a family. Once broken, once scattered. Now joined not by blood, but by choice. And Asha, for the first time since losing her own, didn't just feel safe. She felt like she belonged. Truly, by choice, and for good. A life rebuilt, a future secured, a home deserved. And this story didn't end in fear. It ended in peace. Not in uncertainty, but in the beginning of a life they would share. Together. If this story moved you, we invite you to discover more true stories from the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who blazed a path forward. Subscribe. Share. Tell us what you felt in the comments. Join us again to walk this untamed land. Thank you.